Okay, Moby Dick, chapter 41, also called Moby Dick. A lot happens in this chapter, and we're gonna go through it item by item. As an outline, we're going to talk about the prose in this chapter, which is absolutely gorgeous. It's some of the most beautiful prose I've read in American literature. We're going to talk about Ishmael and who he really is. We're going to talk about the immortality of the whale. And we're going to talk about the immortality of man. We're starting to see structurally and narratively why so much work has been done in these first 200 pages to set up the different personalities of the different narrators. And I'm not sure there actually are different narrators. I know that's been thrown out or posited by many people before. I'm not sure that's true. I think it's not inaccurate to say that Ishmael has multiple personalities, but that doesn't mean that he's actually different people. Let me start from the beginning of this chapter. Ishmael is narrating again. And we're going to use some math here to explain who Ishmael is, so to speak. The first line is, I, Ishmael, was one of that crew. My shouts had gone up with the rest. My oath had been welded with theirs, and stronger I shouted, and more did I hammer and clinch my oath because of the dread in my soul. A wild, mystical, sympathetical feeling was in me. Ahab's quenchless feud seemed mine. With greedy ears I learned the history of that murderous monster against whom I and all the others had taken our oaths of violence and revenge. Okay, transitive property here. Ahab is the crew. Ahab is Ishmael. Actually, I said that backwards. Ishmael is the crew. Ishmael is Ahab. But with the transitive property, it works in all directions. This is interesting. Hang on to that thought. You might even want to write it down. We've got Ishmael identifying himself as part of the crew, not just as a member of a group, but as one body. But also, Ahab's quenchless feud is mine. He's dissolving into Ahab. He begins to talk then of the whale. He's trying to explain, or justify maybe, how it is that this quest for vengeance became so personal to him, even though he freely admits to being terrified out of his mind. He starts to talk about the personality of the whale, or the role that the whale plays in the minds of sailors. And he gives it mythic proportions. Now, he starts out doing this, much like the sub-sub, our buddy who likes to refer to other writers, often incorrectly, and occasionally completely made up. He talks about these third-person sources as evidence. And I believe this comes up in the next chapter too, the whiteness of the whale. He's trying to explain in that chapter what it is specifically that makes the white whale so terrifying. We'll get there in a minute. But, like most scholars, he tries to use evidence proposed by other people and pull it all together and let the weight of the references persuade you that he's right. Now, when we're looking at these individual references, it's worth identifying not just the errors in them, because it brings into question how truthful or how smart our narrator is, but also I want us to think about the intentional nature of these inaccuracies, because Melville knew he was intentionally putting in stuff that was not right. Melville was not an idiot, all right? So even though our narrators might be wrong, he knows they're wrong. and he wants us to see the error. Either, and I think both of these are true, either to discredit the narrator or to show the gap between fact and truth. This is part of why Moby Dick gets difficult to read. All right. As we're going to see, we're going to continue to see, we're talking about infinity in this book, and we're talking about immortality. I'm starting to get ahead of myself, so I am going to go back to the text. And in my copy of this, I'm going to page 197. And again, this is chapter 41. On 197, it says, one of the wild suggestings referred to as at last coming to be linked with the white whale in the minds of the superstitiously inclined was the unearthly conceit that Moby Dick was ubiquitous, that he had actually been encountered in opposite latitudes at one and the same instant of time. Nor, credulous as such minds may have been, was this conceit altogether without some faint show of superstitious probability. In other words, even though this is superstition and myth and outrageous, that doesn't mean it's wrong. For as the secrets of the currents in the sea have never yet been divulged, even to the most erudite research, so the hidden ways of the sperm whale when beneath the surface remain, in great part, unaccountable to his pursuers, and from time to time have originated the most curious and contradictory speculations regarding them, especially concerning the mystic modes whereby, after sounding to a great depth, he transports himself with such vast swiftness to the most widely distant points. A few lines down on page 198. Hence, by inference, it has been believed by some whalemen that the Northwest Passage, so long a problem to man, was never a problem to the whale. Forced into familiarity, then, with such prodigies as these, and knowing that after repeated, intrepid results, the white whale had escaped alive, it cannot be much matter of surprise that some whalemen should go still farther in their superstitions, declaring Moby Dick not only ubiquitous, but immortal. For immortality is but ubiquity in time. For immortality is but ubiquity in time. Now we've poked at some of the sex jokes that Ishmael's been throwing in with his sperm whales and his Queen Mab and things like this. I think that's a way of whistling past the graveyard, because we are in fact talking about what it is that creates and destroys life. We're talking about immortality, which is why this has to be a sperm whale. Again, I don't know where we're going to end up with all of these themes, but they keep coming back, and they're carefully built. I mentioned a few minutes ago about Ishmael identifying with Ahab, and also Ishmael identifying as the sub-librarian, and the increasing occurrence of this third-person omniscient narrator. Other websites like Shmoop that I keep directing us to, and lots of learned scholars with much more information than I have, they are persuaded that there are multiple narrators in this story, and maybe there are. But I think if we've got ubiquity in time, and we've got immortality, and we've got ubiquity in place, and a universalness of the whale, I don't think that it's outrageous to think that we've also got ubiquity in a narrator. We've got something that is bigger than a whale and bigger than a man. It's the very essence of the struggle between what it is to be alive. So I don't think that we need to be reductive or simplistic. I don't think it's an all or nothing equation when it comes down to what's the whale and what's the narrator. I think the answer is all of the above. And the truth is somewhere in that muck. Ishmael goes on in this chapter to discuss more how it is that Ahab went absolutely bonkers when he lost his leg. But before I step on that, sorry, I'm looking through my notes as I do this. Oh, where am I? So Moby Dick, page 199. Here I am. I found myself. Ishmael goes in and begins to describe the actual encounter between Ahab and Moby Dick when Ahab lost his leg. And he describes, Ahab pretty much attacking this whale with a 6-inch knife. And the whale uses his sickle-shaped jaw to remove the leg of Ahab. And not for the first time, Ishmael says that the whale did this with malice aforethought. He knew what he was doing, and he did it. So starting on the top of page 200, small reason was there to doubt then that ever since that almost fatal encounter, Ahab had cherished a wild vindictiveness against the whale. All the more fell for that in his frantic morbidness he at last came to identify with him, not only all his bodily woes, but all his intellectual and spiritual exasperations. So now Ahab's identifying with the whale. Again, using our transitive property, that means that Ishmael identifies with the whale too, which means that we do. Okay, back to the text. The white whale swam before him as the monomaniac incarnation of all those malicious agencies which some deep men feel eating in them, till they are left living on with half a heart and half a lung. That's one of my favorite lines ever, by the way. That intangible malignity which has been from the beginning, to whose dominion even the modern Christians ascribe one half of the world's. Ahab did not fall down and worship it like them, but deliriously transferring its idea to the abhorred white whale, he pitted himself, all mutilated, against it. All that most maddens and torments, all that stirs up the lees of things, all truth with malice in it, all that cracks the sinews and cakes the brain, all the subtle demonisms of life and thought, all evil to crazy Ahab, were visibly personified and made practically assailable in Moby Dick. He piled upon the whale's white hump the sum of all the general rage and hate felt by his whole race from Adam down, and then, as if his chest had been a mortar, he burst his hot heart's shell upon it. It is not probable that this monomania in him took its instant rise at the precise time of its bodily dismemberment. Then, in darting at the monster, knife in hand, he had but given loose to a sudden, passionate, corporal animosity. And when he received the stroke that tore him, he probably but felt the agonizing bodily laceration, but nothing more. Yet when but by this collision, forced to turn towards home, and for long months of days and weeks Ahab and anguish lay stretched together in one hammock, rounding in midwinter that dreary, howling Patagonian cape, then it was that his torn body and gashed soul bled into one another, and so interfusing, made him mad. So in case we haven't figured it out yet, the author just made it very clear for us. The whale is the embodiment of all of the anguish and frustration and fear and torment in the world. And as Ahab gives part of himself to this whale, he becomes part of the whale, and the whale becomes part of him. I don't know that it's insanity. Ishmael keeps referring to Ahab as crazy Ahab. But sometimes, as we've seen, this might be just to leave himself a back door. So that, even though he's already said, Ahab's feud seemed mine, which meaning that, I took this personally too. This became my fight. Well, but in case we start to think, well, Ishmael, you're just crazy too, Ishmael can back off and say, yeah, I meant the crazy Ahab, not me, it was somebody else. But it's laid out. We keep being given back doors away from the truth of the story. But we're being very carefully led into, again, the universality of it. So we're not just talking about the immortality of man or the immortality of the whale. We're talking about the constant presence of anguish in existence. And the decision to either fight it, whether or not we can beat it or lose to it, or to stay on land and run away from it. I think that's what Moby Dick is about. Do we take and fight the horror of the world, knowing we might lose to it? Or do we just run away and hide?